afternoon, Professor Lau and classmates. I am tasked to report on the introduction to child language acquisition. So I'll start this discussion first with the issue on this chapter. So this is Gerald Malcolm Durrell. He was a British naturalist who wrote a book on My Family and Other Animals, where in this book he differentiate or compare the human beings or the people of Corfu and the animal in the zoo, whether they have similarities in the way they communicate with each other. So these are some of the questions that we can find in this chapter. So first, what is language? Last meeting, we have differentiated language with uppercase letter L and lowercase letter l, but we are going to focus on languages, which is capital letter L. So this is the structured system of communication used by humans. Well, it doesn't matter whether you have the ability to produce sounds or not, like the deaf people, but the way people communicate, that is already a language. Next, acquiring a language. We'll also differentiate how it is to acquire a language and to learn a language. When we say acquire a language, we are going to learn it, not to really focus on it, but to acquire it innately. There is language in us. So we're just going to acquire it or learn it in a simple way. So there is this question, which is, what skills and knowledge do children have to master in order to acquire a language? How do the children really learn the language? So we have here the 6 steps. So obviously there is this brain, the child's brain, which is also known as the tabula rasa, where there is no the child doesn't have any knowledge about everything. So first, they're just going to distinguish first sounds, then differentiate sounds from what is sounds from their mothers and the sounds from their surroundings. Then later on, they are going to produce each sounds, and then those sounds will be paired with different sounds to make words, and then that word will have its own meaning. Then words will be connected to another words so that they will form a sentences, and then at the end of that stage, the child can now understand and think critically on the different meanings of the sentences they have produced. So that is how a child acquire a language. So language or languages. We should be talking about acquiring languages rather than acquiring a language. And the most obvious difference is in our vocabulary. We have not just to acquire a language, we're not just going to focus on our native language, but as we grow older, let us learn other languages. For example, in the difference in vocabulary, we have here the word rose. When we say rose, it is a kind of a flower which we may associate with fresh or with sweet. And we have here from Spanish, they call it una rosa. In Arabic, they call it warda. And in Japanese, they call it bara. Whatever the vocabulary is or the name is, it still means rose. So the differences in language, first, the sound of the language, the way in which words are combined, and the way in which language is used. Let us now differentiate an English language versus the Turkish language. So in English language, we say that English language is a word of order language, or there is this so-called patterns in English. When you disarrange words in English in their specific order, then you may mean different meanings. For example, when we say the man bites the dog, this is a different sentence from the sentence the dog bites the man. When we say the man bites the dog, the man himself is the one who bites the dog. But when we say the dog bites the man, then the dog itself is the one who bites the man. So when we exchange or disarrange words and follow different patterns or order, the sentence will be different. There is this passive form, the WH question form, the negative form, imperative form, and so on. So English language also has inflectional markings. These inflectional markings may be added to a word wherein these words will now have different meanings. For example, when we say affixes, sometimes when we say able, then we're going to add the prefix "un," which means unable. Then the word able will have different meanings, especially um, when it's going to be unable. For nouns also, for example, chair, we mean singular, and then when we say chairs, we mean plural. So there is an inflectional marking with letter S at the end of every noun. Next is verbs. Also, we are going to have different tenses like the past tense, present tense, and future tense, where some markings or inflectional markings are added at the end of the verbs, not to specify or say whether it is from the past, from the future, or from the present. While in Turkish language, while in Turkish language, they have this default word order, or they only have one word order, which is the SVO pattern. So whether they say the man bites dog, the dog bites man dog bites, it doesn't matter. It only means that the man bites the dog. Okay? It may seem, hindi siya familiar na word na ang, what's this? The human being is the one who bites the dog, but that's what they mean, even though the words in the sentence are disarranged. It also has an inflectional system in which different endings added to nouns and verbs convey who did what to whom. For example, when we say hand, in Turkish it is ej. When we say hands, it is hejer or ezer. When we say my hands, ezerim. So as you can see, even though in English we're going to add words at the beginning of a noun or at the beginning of the subject, in Turkish, the subject is the one, in each order, the subject comes first and then followed by the verb and the object. So when we say in hands, they are elerte. When we say in my hands, ellerimde. So that is the Turkish language. About the child in English and in Turkish, there are also differences in how they acquire language. For example, an English child have this stage 1 of language learning where sentences tend to be combinations of bare stem forms. So the words are always in the bare form. So for example, when we say daddy book, even though the child means daddy's book, the word or the sentence or phrase comes from daddy book. There are no inflectional markings. And two chair. So instead of saying two chairs, the child just simply say two chair. And it also lacks the little words of language, which are the determiners, prepositions, and auxiliaries. For example, even if the child wants to say sit in the chair, the child will just say sit chair. Or this telephone, even though the child wants to say, this is my telephone. So there is the deletion or the lacking of the real words. On the stage 2 of the development of language of a child, markers and real words starts to appear. So it is still short and simple, but sounds more adult-like because of the presence of morphemes. However, in Turkish language, it is the opposite. So the earlier the child knows the language, markers and real words appear at the early stage. And noun and verb inflections are common in the earliest stages of development. At the age of 15 months, so 1 year and 3 months, the child already know how to use inflections. And although young children's utterances are short and simple, they don't look like or sounds like a child language. So they may be heard as an adult-like kind of language. Now, always remember that in the stages or in the development of a language of a child, some children's development are faster and others are slower. That is why children are really diverse. So some may learn faster than others and some may learn a little bit slower than others. And also, some children are born with cognitive impairments. And children acquire 2 or more languages simultaneously. In order for the child not to be bothered in the development of languages or in acquiring language, always remember that even though you want the child to speak in Tagalog and in English, learning or acquiring 2 languages will happen simultaneously. So you're going to teach the child first his or her native language to be followed by his or her second language. Now we have here the design features of language by Hackett and later on Hackett and Altman. So we have here, vocal auditory channel. When we say vocal auditory channel, this language is composed of spoken sounds. The sounds produced in languages. We have also broadcast transmission and directional reception. It is where speech sounds radiate in all directions so that they can be perceived by any listener. So this is when the child knows where the sound was coming from. Next is rapid phasing, where there are some languages that we learn, but then it rapidly disappear or fades. I'm sorry, it is rapid fading. It's not rapid phasing. So that is what we call sometimes the forgotten language. We also have interchangeability, where any human can reproduce any aspects of language they hear, regardless of age and gender. They can interchange languages. It doesn't matter what their age is, what their gender is. Next, complete feedback. Humans have the ability also to learn a language and then they're going to try to monitor their own speech and then give feedbacks on it. And if ever they fail to do the right thing in their languages, then there are adjustments needed, or they can easily adjust the language or the words used. They also have the specialization, where the language is specialized in different organs, uses, for example, the lips, the tongue, the ear, obviously, the vocal tracts. So ear is also, or ear or auditory tract is also specialized in language, because in order for you to communicate, you're going to use your auditory tract or listen carefully to the words or what the speaker wants to convey. Next, semanticity, because every word has its own meaning. arbitrariness. Even though words have fixed meaning, there is also intrinsic reason why any words is related to a particular meaning. So when we say arbitrary, there are words which may have fixed meaning, but you can link this to another words. For example, when we say dog, we can say hound instead of dog. So there are other words that we can use. Next is discreteness, or language is made up of a string of discrete sounds chained together. And these sounds varies only minimally. Next, we also have displacement, where we can talk about things that are remote in time and space. For example, in language, we can talk about the past, we can talk about the future or the present, then we can talk about the future using the tenses of the verbs. We also have productivity, where language can be we can create and understand language in different ways. For example, there are languages or words which we are not familiar of, but using our native language or our knowledge or stock knowledge on these words, then later on we can understand this. So this is productivity. When we say traditional transmission, language is transmitted from one generation to another generation in a traditional way, which is the teaching and learning. Next is quality of patterning. When we say quality of patterning, language exists on two levels. So there are patterns. For first, language or words have exact meaning. And the other is, on the other hand, there is such words are made up of sounds, specifically sounds, but that doesn't convey meaning. So sounds that doesn't convey meaning tend to be paired with other sounds which will be transformed into words which will now convey meanings. Prevarication, language can convey imaginary information, where we can say that, for example, the ocean. When we say ocean, it is a vast sea. No? When we say prevarication, we are going to use our imagination in order to convey new meanings on the word ocean. For example, serenity, refreshing, so that's it. Next is reflexiveness. Language can be used to talk about language itself. And learnability. We are able to learn language. So humans have the ability to learn new languages and to create new languages. Next is, can we teach language to animals? So this is Emily Sue Savage Rumbo. She is a psychologist and primatologist, and she is the one who trained Kanzi and Panbanisha, the two speaking bonobos, using the lexigram and computer-based keyboards. So in order for the bonobos to learn, they have their caregivers, and what Rumbo wants them to learn is for them to be exposed in the language in a natural way. So for them to be exposed in the language, Rumbo wants Kanzi to communicate, or the caregivers to communicate with Kanzi in a natural way, like how humans communicate with other humans. So during Kanzi's free time, they're going to go to the park, to the zoo, and then talk to Kanzi in a human communication way, where they are going to speak on or talk on the events that's going to happen, what does Kanzi wants to do, his favorite foods to eat. So that's it. So at the age of 2, he began to show evidence of understanding speech, By 2.5, he was spontaneously using the lexigram board to communicate with humans himself. And by the age of 5, he could use over 100 symbols and combine words into simple 2- and 3-word utterances. One example of this is when Kanzi says, peanut hide. When Kanzi says, peanut hide, and then look at your pocket, he means that you're hiding a peanut in your pocket, or is there any peanut in your pocket? When Kanzi says, peanut hide, and then point out to the ground, then that means that he hides the peanut on the ground. So you're going to find where he hides the peanut. And when he says, peanut hide, and then point on the drawer in the office, then that means that he wants to eat the peanuts inside the drawer. So that is one example of how Kanzi communicate with humans. So Kanzi preferred word order, which is the actor plus action pattern. So first, Kanzi is going to say the actor, and then later on says the action. For example, when he wants to eat banana, he say, Kanzi, banana, or Kanzi, eat. If he wants to sleep, Kanzi, sleep. So he also tends to produce action words in the order in which he wants the action to be carried out. For example, he wants you to chase him and to tickle him. So there are 2 action words in the sentence. So he wants to chase and tickle. So when he first wants you to chase, then to tickle, he will say chase, tickle. Whatever he wants first, that is the first action that he is going to say. So in this study, can we conclude that apes and humans share similar language learning abilities, or do the abilities of apes stem from different mechanisms? Later on, they realized that maybe it is time for them to study the differences between humans and animals. That is why they developed this study about Kanzi and Aliyah. So Kanzi and Aliyah, they were presented in the same sentences types. Both were tested in familiar surroundings by familiar adults. So they're given sentences which they're going to do what the sentences wants them to do. Some sentences includes take the potato outdoors, go outside and get the potato, and make the dog bite the snake. So there are overall, I think, less or more than 60 words that they're going to follow. So overall, the result says that Kanzi responds about 74%, while Aliyah only responded 38% correctly. So the researchers reported that Kanzi and Aliyah, or human and animals, have the same comprehension abilities, but at some points, animals have better abilities, or apes have better abilities than the child. But later on, they realized that Kanzi is already 8 years old at the time when the study or the research happens, and or no, Kanzi is also already 5 years old. 8 years old. Yeah, 8 years old when that research happened, and Aliyah was just only 2 years old. So there is really a gap between them. So this research concerns only which aspects of the potential of language acquisitions are shared across species, and not whether animals can develop the same sophisticated linguistic abilities as humans, because we all know that humans have sophisticated linguistic abilities that animals, or mostly animals, cannot do. Now we have here the different animal communication system. The simple forms of communication, the quite complex communication, and the highly social animals communication system. First is the simple forms of communication. These are some of the examples. This is where the dogs bark, the cat's hiss, and the lamb's bleat. And the quite complex communication system, there is interaction, or they can already show their emotions based on how they react or communicate. And when we say highly social animals communication system, there is the usage or the Hackett's design features of language can somehow be seen in this way of communication. For example, when they say bees dance to communicate the direction and distance of food from the hive, they show displacement. But humans are different from bees, because bees cannot perform or cannot dance new movements for them to communicate. Parang iba na siya. They will not communicate well if bees will dance differently from their norms. Okay. When we say vervet monkeys have distinct alarm calls to signal the presence of different predators, they portray arbitrariness. And then when Bengalese finches produce songs made up of strings of syllable-like motifs that have been compared to human grammars, then they portray discreteness. Now, the shared aspects of language, we're going to discuss on the categorical perception, because that is how we share that kind of language in the animals. For example, categorical perception is an important feature of the human language system, and it refers to humans' ability to register some differences in speech sounds and ignore others. For example, we have the ability to differentiate pa and ba, or ta and da, or let's say f and v. So there are differences. We have the ability to comprehend on that differences. So number one, we have the chinchillas in animals. They were trained by Kuhl and Malier to respond on the categorically to stimuli ranging across a continuum from da to ta. And then it's not clear how similar human and animal abilities are in the respect, but other species may share some aspects of the human language learning mechanisms. But we are aware that there are things, or there are learning mechanisms where animals cannot do, which humans can. So there are abilities where human can do and animals cannot. Next, we have here the language centers of the brain. We have here the human brain. The brain tends to be lateralized for language and localized for language. So for example, we have here the aphasia. Aphasia is a language disorder resulting from brain damage. So it is a disorder where whenever there are a trauma, or let's say an accident, then there is a damage on the brain, they may have this aphasia, or there is the so-called abnormalities in their language. So the brain also tends to be localized. There are local areas in the brain which may be developed, or this is the part of the brain where language develops. So first is the Broca's area. Broca's area is named after Paul Pierre Broca. Broca's area is the part where the superior temporal gyrus is particularly found. So that there is the part over here sa yung nakikita niya sa gilid ng Broca area yan. The Hershey's gyrus, or the superior temporal gyrus. I'm sorry. Next is the Wernicke's area, which is named after Carl Wernicke. So there are some brain regions are implicated in sign language as in spoken language. So some people have disabilities which may hinder them from producing sounds. So some part of the brain, they may use them for sign languages, especially for the deaf people. And localization and lateralization are not present from birth, but they are gradually developing as the child ages. So when they are still babies, localization and lateralization are not yet present in the brain of the child, but then later on they develop gradually as the child gets older. So there is a study also regarding the usage of ERPs, or the event-related potentials, which means that there are changes in electrical potential that occur in neurons as the brain process information. So I think this is used by the Chinese English bilingual speakers, where some of whom had started learning at the age of, no, this is a study from Weber, Fox, and Neville, where some of whom had started learning English in early childhood, and some started to learn English after the age of 16 years. Then later on, at the end of the study, the researchers reported that the early and late learning bilinguals showed very different ERP responses to violations of English syntactic rules. I think in the MALT-1, we have a discussion on this, on the bilingualism. No, is it bilingualism? Yes. Kay Ma'am, I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm nakalimutan ko yung name. Marnel, something like that. Na the differences between the child who learn new language, kung saan ba yung mas fast learner sa language, is it either the old learners or the young learners? So it is still the same with Weber, Fox, and Neville. So there are differences in the ERPs of the learners who are English Chinese learners who learn English when they're still young, and learners who learn English at the age of 16 years old, or medyo older than 15 years old. 16 years old, yeah. Next is, we also have here what else might be built in the human brain. So we have here the three constraints: representational constraints, architectural constraints, and chronotopic constraints. So first is the representational constraints. This is the idea that knowledge about the properties of language is encoded in our genes. So it is obviously says that language, or properties of language, is already innate to human beings. Architectural constraints is the idea that genes specify a set of blueprints for building language acquisition mechanisms. So mostly in this area, there is the building blocks na there are languages na later on, as an infant grew, gradually siyang mag-develop. Parang later on, nag-build siya ng languages or na words na from the infants themselves. Yung every time maka-hear siya ng new words, para maging building blocks siya for another words to be learned later on sa development. So there are blueprints for building, a set of blueprints for building language acquisition. Next, chronotopic constraints. These constrain the timing of development, ensuring that certain mechanisms are available at the right point in development. So there are needs na at this kind of age, or at this stage, dapat there is this kind of certain mechanism that the child must develop. So chronotopic constraints make sure that a child develop this kind of mechanism at this right age, or at least right point. Next, we have the right environment. So I have here the study, or no, I have here Jenny, an example of the child's acquiring language based on his or her environment. So Jenny is the feral child. So actually Jenny is a child wherein she was deprived of language, no. At 20 months of age, she was maltreated by her father. So Jenny was beaten by her father, and then whenever Jenny attempted to make sounds or to produce sounds, Jenny will be punished. So at the age of 13, later on, Jenny is afraid of making noises because whenever she makes or produce sounds, there is a punishment that comes afterwards. So at 13 years of age, she was discovered and saved, and later on they knew that Jenny, at the age of 13, only knew few words, which are mother, walk, go, red, blue, and green. And the two phrases that she could only pronounce or produce is stop it and no more. So there is this trauma where Jenny experienced in the hands of his father. So deaf children do not acquire a language unless they have intensive training or are exposed to sign language from early on. So this means that in the development of language of a child, the right environment also has its part, no, in helping the child develop or learn or acquire new languages. Even though that child is loved by his or her parents, if the parents are not really vocal or they don't form communications with their child or children, the child will still have difficulties in learning languages. That is why some people are really engaging their child in communication. Some parents are really engaging their child in a communication so that they can also develop their language, or they can acquire their language and be able to use new words and sentences. We also have here the amount of speech that children hear can speed up or slow down the language acquisition process. So how much you talk to your child, then the child later on will learn. Kunwari, minsan mo lang silang kausapin, then later on, maybe they develop shyness, or whenever they speak and then you say, no, that's not right. So instead of being vocal, the child will just, instead of saying something to you, the child will just shut up. No. So some theories state that the role of the input is to trigger the innate knowledge that is encoded in the genes, to allow the child to map this innate knowledge onto the language that she is hearing. So parents are the input, no? What we are going to do is to trigger it. Actually, acquiring a language is not just really turuan mo siya kung ano yung mga language. For example, bahay, ganun. Our role is to speak with them, no? Communicate with them. So, for them to discover themselves what languages or what knowledge they have, innate knowledge that they have. So others says that the input is given a more substantial role. So always remember that exposure to language is clearly necessary. In order for a person to acquire a language, you must be exposed to that language. We have discussed this, I believe, last meeting. So there are undergoing debates, still debates regarding there are similarities or differences in the mechanisms or the abilities of an animal and the human being in terms of acquiring a language or language learning. So, understandably, apes may have the same characteristics or abilities just like human beings, but they don't level the sophisticatedness, or animal communication system doesn't level the sophisticatedness and the complexity of the human language. So there are certain abilities that humans can and animals cannot. So that's it. That's my report for today, and thank you for listening.